Hello, welcome to Assessment Assistant Part 7. In Part 6, you learned how to create a create screen for creating data in the data model and popping it into the database. Part 7, we're going to learn how to make an edit screen, which isn't that much different from a create screen. It's just a few things that you need to do in addition to this. So I'm going to take you through the steps. First things first is creating the blank page, and it's going to be a blank razor page. So if I were to do this, I'd go down in here to Pages, Academic Programs, say Add, Razor Page, and then say Razor Page Empty. And in this case, I've already done it, so you're going to set the name of that page to Edit. You can name it whatever you want to, but if it's an edit screen, it's probably going to be called Edit, which is going to give you these two pieces of code here, the edit.cshtml and the edit.cshtml.cs, which is basically the interface and the code that supports it, or as you'd like to say, the view and the controller. All right, so what do we do first? First things first is this is going to be mostly empty, but you will have a blank public class called edit model, which inherits from page model. But the first thing that you need to do is you need to get access to the data, which means that you need to put in a property which is the context, which is going to be the application DB context, which is what controls access to the data. So I make this, I can make this a private in this case. It doesn't have to be public. I made it a public because I was doing some experimentation, but private read-only, and then the application DB context, which by the way lives in assessmentassistant.data. I do have a using here, so I didn't actually need to put this reference to the namespace here, but I'm usually pretty good about that in the code because I really do want to know exactly what I'm working with, but I could just as easily have taken this away and it would still work just fine. Put it back and underscore context. Now, I need to write a constructor. There is no constructor already default written. So the constructor is going to have obviously the same name as the class, public edit model, and I'm going to pass it in an instance of the context, which of course is assessmentassistant.data.application.db context, and I'm going to set the internal public read-only underscore context variable equal to context. That's going to allow me to have access to the context anywhere that I need it. In this case, I'm going to bring in the property that I'm going to be editing. This is going to be actually the model that's being editing. I use the bind property indicator there, and I bring it in as the academic program. So it's assessment assistant.models.academic program get set. That's basically the property accessor. And in this case, it's academic program because guess what? I'm editing the academic program. It's going to be whatever model it is that you're editing that's going to be there. All right, now I made some changes. This is where the big changes between create and edit are, is right here. Okay, I need to get the actual instance of the model or the row in the database that I'm gonna be editing. Now let's do this. Notice that I have in here public async task on get async with an ID property passed to it. All right, let's actually see how that's going to work in the from the interface itself. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start the program up and running, and I'm going to wait for just a second for it to come up. And here we go. Now, I'm going to type in the URL that goes with this. This is going to be, I put this in the academic program edit directory, and notice I've got ID, I've got an actual get parameter ID equals 1, which tells it to go out and get from the database. There's the database. Let's go ahead and execute, and I've got down here the academic program ID, the program title, the program description, and the measurement period. Voila, that's what's in the database, and guess what? That's what gets pulled up right here in the page that we've created. And the page has the same fields as the create, which is program title, description, and measurement period. All right, and I have the ability to update it. And I can do that. If I go in here and say head shrinkers and make that 3 and hit update, it's going to pop an exception because I haven't written index yet. I'm going to write that. That's actually need to write that because the index is the default page for anything that I do with academic program, whether I'm creating or reading or updating or adding things to it. But if I come back over here and I re-execute this, I can see that Head Shrinkers 3, it was updated. So this isn't really causing any major issues here. Now, let's go ahead and close that and go back to the code and look at what's happening here. So in other words, in the constructor, okay, I've got the context which comes over. In the onGet, it gets the ID, and that is the primary key integer ID of academic program. Okay, in other words, that ID is this ID, academic program ID. Okay, and how do I know that? Because first I check to see if the ID passed is null, and if it's null, in other words, if I don't pass it something, it's going to return a not found. But here, I go academic program equals, and I await, does an asynchronous call, and sets the academic program ID equal to the ID that was passed over to it, and that's the ID it's going to pull from the database. If the academic program isn't pulled from the database, if it's equal to null, it's going to return a not found. Otherwise, it's going to return back the current page, which is what you just saw, the page with those three, the text box, the text area, and the drop-down list on it. All right, so that gets posted. The user does stuff, enters things, and then they're going to click that submit button. Now, remember that submit button down here is part of a form. Okay, it's an input, type submit, value equals update. Okay, that's up there, ties in with the form tag, method equals post. So over here, when they click that button, you're going to get on post async. So what does it do? First thing it does, checks to see if model state is valid, which is going to run the validation, which the validation is built into it. We've got those. I'll go into the page itself, and we'll look at that for a second. And then it does this little piece right here. Now, I've got some other things that I did that I've copied code that I usually uncomment as I make changes, just to control the access to specific users. Okay, I've got that commented out because I'm not doing that right now. I will go back and I'll fix that. I actually haven't decided in the user model. I've done a little bit of it, but I haven't decided exactly in the user model whether I want to assign that to a role, assign that to individual users. I'll probably do it as role-based, but that's the beauty of the identity model that's built into Microsoft, is I've got that capability of making that decision a little bit later. Now, when I click that submit button, on post async gets called, checks the model state. If the model state isn't valid, it returns the page. And when it returns the page, any of the validators that are out there in that page are going to show up in red and tell you what's missing. If we're good, it's going to set the state to entity state modified of the context with that specific values of academic program that the user entered. Hasn't gone to the database yet. Guess what? Next step. And here it is. Okay, await, context, save changes async. Okay, it can actually go and say, hey, look, what's the problem here? Okay, this is a call to academic programs exist, which, by the way, goes out here and finds to see if it actually does exist. So there's a few validation steps going on right here, but the bottom line is, if you did everything right, it's going to go ahead, set the state to modified, and then it's going to go ahead and save the changes that you made back to the database, or basically update the database, and then redirect to the index page. I have one more method that I wrote here. I did write the academic program exists. I did write this piece of code here. Basically, it checks to see if that does exist in the database, because I'm actually updating the academic program based on a query that is updating based on the primary key, which is academic program ID. If academic program ID doesn't have an entry in the database, it's gonna crash on that, and I'd rather it crash cleanly. So it does check before it updates the database that the ID that it's trying to update for the academic program ID does exist. I got one more piece of code that I wrote, which basically, in this case, was the same as in create, the measurement periods, because I do want to fill in the drop down with the measurement periods. Let's click back over here now into the page, and there's one thing in this page that's really important. This input type equals hidden ASP4 academic program ID. That's the primary key of the model. That's the model key and the primary key in the database. It needs to be here, otherwise it won't be able to store that value to be able to update the correct record. All right, the rest of it's pretty straightforward here. You've got the same fields, the input using the ASP4, using the razor to make the determination of what am I going to show, in this case like a text box. I did have. Like in this case, the second field, short description, is a text area. So I had to specifically tell it inside the text area tags, and I'll go ahead and close this up here so it's a little bit tighter. And inside the text area tags, I tell it to put in the program description, which I can access through this .model.academic program description. What is this doing? Well, this is this which has the property model. The property model is this class right here, edit model. That is the actual what is accessed there, and it has the property edit model, and edit model. Has property academic program, and the property academic program has also the property of the program description. The last one, not necessarily difficult, but remember it was a drop-down list, so I have to use that same. I used a delegate. The delegate says, okay, I'm gonna have this drop-down list for first. It's going to be the field measurement period of academic program. That's what's going to be used, and that's what's going to get updated. It's a select box, so I have to tell it where does it get the values to go into the select box, the drop down, and which one is going to be the default. Well, the default is just the one that it currently is, which is measurement period. So that's what it should default to. And voila, that, oh, and down here, this section is not necessarily in the create, but it is here, the validation scripts partial. So that's just helping if I have to do some validation. So all those pieces go together to create this edit that works. Okay, this code is available on my GitHub. It would be good for you to go through and understand all the steps that are necessary to build a edit page. Because you do, now a lot of code, there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. That's the beauty of this entity framework, is a lot of the work is taken off of your hands. But you do need to first know what the model is that's going to be edited, and be able to put it into the interface and be able to update when you're done. So that's all those pieces. The next thing that I will do is show you how to create the page where you list multiple values from the database so that you can then click on those and then jump to the edit. Woo, that's going to be interesting and fun. Good programming.